First of all, I think I support the Industrial Revolution. We take for granted how many conveniences were brought about by the exponential increase of wealth around the Industrial Revolution. Indoor plumbing, modern medicine, modern transportation, and so on. But it's also a useful exercise to go back and think about the unintended negative consequences of all of these things and of the mass increase of wealth brought about by the revolution. I think that the leftist tactic for criticizing the modern world is a bit backwards. They criticize perceived bigotry, that is, racism, sexism, all these buzzwords, but then they criticize it on economic terms. They criticize capitalism, but capitalism is kind of itself a buzzword. What does it mean? Well, it could be taken to mean essentially changes brought about by the Industrial Revolution. But I don't believe it's correct to criticize the Industrial Revolution on economic terms, on an economic basis. I think the Industrial Revolution should be criticized on a cultural basis, on the changes that the mass increase of wealth brought to human society. So leftist discourse has sort of tried and failed to criticize the modern world through the problems brought about by the Industrial Revolution. But just because other people have made failed arguments in the past doesn't mean that there is no correct points to be made, no correct criticisms to make, and we should criticize everything, of course. I should also point out that for this video, I'll be using the words scarcity and abundance in a relative sense. That is, scarcity and abundance are opposite extremes, but you can be relatively more scarce or relatively more abundant. So without further ado, I can think of three problems with industrialized societies. So first of all, it creates distance between the workers and what they produce. Sure, workers receive compensation, but it is in the cold form of money. They do not keep the products and services they create. So capitalism, it leads to specialization, and specialization relegates one's work to that of a single task, that is, a narrow slice of tasks within an industry. Sometimes the, in fact, direct benefit of one's work is not even obvious. If you're a middle manager and people above you make the major decisions and the people at the bottom do all the hands-on stuff, it's kind of unclear what your role even is. All of the products of one's work, and additionally, are enjoyed by someone else, and all that one consumes is made by someone else. And what I mean by that is, one does not own the property that they have in the sense of having made it. If I look around me and I look at my possessions, I didn't personally make any of them, unless in a very abstract sense, in contributing to society, and I get contributions back. A man does not get the fulfillment of having built the house he lives in, sewn the clothes he wears, having farmed the food he eats. Instead, he consumes products from the vast economic system, the system that removes true fulfillment from the work, the fulfillment of designing and working to make the very goods and services what you consume. Of course, in pre-industrial societies, there was delegation and trading of responsibilities. If you think of the feudal system, for example, you think, of course, there was specialization. But it took on a very social and human nature. You could, say, personally know all of the people you traded with. If you go to the shoemaker, maybe you know the shoemaker. He's from your town. I'm not suggesting that money or markets are a new thing, but they have become a very different animal under industrialization. That is its greatest strength, but also its greatest pitfall. In a globalized economy, you have no human connection with the people who made your shoes or furniture. Your life is a series of cold transactions. And moreover, the system is swamped by middlemen, people who do not directly produce a clear product at all, but rather keep the system turning, facilitating production. Say lawyers and bankers, for example. Their work is kind of to create the right paperwork. I'm even counting managers and analysts. Finally, complicated economic hierarchies of interconnected influence will arise, and suddenly our economy is in the hands of people who we've never met and do not care for. This removes agency from ourselves, and while it's true that in the past we might not have had agency either, you could at least point to the king and the castle who made the bad economic decisions. But now, when the economy goes bad, who do you point to? It's all abstract. My next point is that culture can be viewed as a function of scarcity, and therefore wealth reduces culture. And when I say culture, I'm not talking about a lot of the senses the word is used today. I'm not talking about when sociologists talk about culture, where they would say culture to kind of mean a synonym for collective personality. So they would say the culture of this corporation to mean like the collective personality of the corporation. That's not what I mean. And especially, I'm not talking about like modern fashion, the latest trend that will be here for 10 years, that sort of thing. I'm talking about intergenerational stuff, like the type of stories that are passed down, architecture, religion, art, clothing, but not like the latest fashion, but clothing that is deeply rooted in history. And same with music. When I say culture, let's try to quantify that. What types of things come to mind? Well, I think one component of culture is distinctiveness, which specifically means your culture is a culture in that it is different from other cultures. If you go to some other place and they have exactly the same mannerisms and appearance and everything that you have, you can't really say that you have a unique culture because it's the same everywhere. So it's what makes you different that enables culture. Furthermore, I would say that a sort of uniformity enables culture, where if you go to a region, if every single person in that region does something different, then you can't really say there's one culture because the culture is just everyone is different. But if there is some commonality, some similarity among behavior, among appearance in that culture, then that you could say is cultural. Now, wealth poses a challenge to this because in a pre industrialized world, poor transportation forces a level of isolation between peoples, and this allows people to develop independently and therefore develop differently. Consider the difference between Japanese animation and American animation. The geographical difference allowed the styles to develop independently for a period of time. When people don't develop styles independently, we don't call it culture, we just call it the way everyone is. And when everyone is connected, everything just bleeds together into one monoculture where everything is the same. But I think more fundamentally, industrialization creates wealth, which creates abundance, and abundance is the enemy of within group uniformity. Because scarcity, as I went over, is kind of a big part of culture. So consider the Inuit. Why did the Inuit all live in igloos? Because of the scarcity of their environment. They had to live in igloos because the building supplies they had available was snow and ice. And the igloo was the most efficient way to stay warm as they needed to stay warm. And it was only because of the scarcity of their environments. They couldn't afford or they didn't have the technology for fancy air conditioned or heated homes. But now the Inuit are what is descendant of the Inuit people. They no longer live in igloos. So the igloo is a cultural memory, except in the places industrialization has not taken hold. See, when there is abundance, it creates customizability. When there is customizability, everyone can be different, and when everyone can be different, there are no elements that are uniform within the society that you can pin your description to of that is culture. No things you can point to and say that is the cultural element because everyone is different, because everyone can afford endless customizability. Or let's say it even is the case that everyone picks the same thing because it's just the cheapest or whatever. Well, it's still not so much a distinct culture because probably because of the transportation abilities of our modern society, that most efficient, most cheap thing will be transported everywhere. So everywhere will be the same, which erases regional differences. So when you hear about culture in industrialized countries, what you often hear described is things that have not yet succumbed to just endless customizability, or something that is not in the category where no matter where you live, it's just the cheapest thing on the market and it's the thing everyone gets. It's the thing that regionally it makes you special. And my point is that in the past there was more stuff like that, and when we talk about culture today, in the sense of that I'm using the word, we often talk about things that are very old, because in the past things were more decentralized, because there was less long range communication, worse transportation technologies, and therefore there was less centralized big markets. There were small markets, and this gave rise to aspects that made particular regions special and unique. The next point is that it places our bodies in environments to which we are not evolved. Now, I think people overstate this point. I don't buy the idea that human evolution stopped after we left Africa or something like that. I think human evolution has continued through all of human history. But to the extent that we have new technology that we have not had time to adapt to, we have not had time to adapt to that new technology. For example, the Western diet, I think, is something kind of perverse because our bodies have not had time to adapt to it, but it makes people obese. Or take video games that are designed to just keep you addicted. Obviously, these are a new technology. We have not adapted to such stimulus, so people get addicted to TV or video games. But in the past, there was limited access to carbohydrates, and dopamine was something reliable. Dopamine could not be gamed by video games. Our dietary preferences could not be gamed by the Western diet. So it opens up our bodies to be put in unnatural environments and gamed. So that's 3 points, but I actually forgot I do have a final point. And the final point is that industrialization has increased the power of human beings. So it increases what can be done by human civilization for good and for bad. But there should be special focus on irreversible harms that can be done. For example, we have dangerous technologies like atomic weapons, which can be used to blow up whole cities. We have fossil fuels, which burned can create pollution. We have powers to do a lot of negative effects to the environment, so we have to be aware of the negative powers that we have. So, what can be done about these? Well, I come from the intellectual tradition, which tells me that economic freedom is a freedom that is good and to be respected in its own right. But we also have to wonder about if we can do anything to counteract the problems which I went over. So, I have a few guidelines which I think, with self discipline on a personal and civilizational level, which, if done, can slow the negative effects of these. So, one example is to, when possible, if you have a choice between hiring someone and doing it yourself, you do it yourself. For example, you can do your own yard work because the fruits of your own labor bring fulfillment. Teach yourself how to do things like plumbing work, fix a car, and so on. Now, the government would prefer that everything be done through financial transactions because then there's a money trail which they can tax. It's bad for them if you do work for yourself. They would prefer that you hire a nanny or a daycare to take care of your kid as opposed to parenting your kid yourself. Because if you hire a daycare, they can tax that exchange. But if it's not done through an economic exchange and you raise your own kid, and do work for yourself. They can't tax that, but it's beneficial for yourself in the long run. The next thing you can do is to remember your tradition, learn, if only for your own enjoyment, the way your ancestors used to do even run of the mill things. I think that the Japanese people strike a good balance between tradition and industrialization because they're a modern society, but they still remember the way they used to do things with kimonos, samurai, etc. They are all about their own culture. And they maintain in their everyday life some aspects of their tradition here and there, like in their food and their architecture and so on. So the next advice is just to not succumb to negative addictions to modern food, sugar, to video games and that sort of thing. Things where probably your body is not adapted to, so these are only exist to exploit you. Now, the final statement is that where present, we should be wary of human capabilities that bring about irreversible outcomes, but that will possibly be the subject of a future video.